What you're about to hear is a first-person confession, inspired by the real story, or perhaps the legend, of the Russian sleep experiment. Just one voice from inside the lab, telling what should never be known. I never meant to deprive them of sleep. I meant to strip them of their souls. They called it a necessary sacrifice, a patriotic experiment to push the limits of human endurance. But for me, it was a question I couldn't leave unanswered. What happens when the mind is denied its sanctuary? What waits in the shadows of exhaustion? I was chosen because I didn't flinch, because I understood that progress demands darkness. They handed me 5 men and a formula and told me to observe, but I didn't just observe. I listened, I recorded, I memorized every scream and silence. The official version buries this in myth. I can't. Not anymore. The voices are still with me. The scratching on the walls never truly stopped. So if you're still listening, this is not a story. It's a confession. And once you hear it, you'll never forget it. The letter arrived without ceremony. A plain envelope, delivered by a man who didn't speak, who didn't meet my eyes. Inside, a single sheet of paper bearing the seal of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. I read it once, then again, and felt the weight of history press down on my chest. I was to report to Facility 47 within 24 hours. No reason given, no refusal permitted. I knew the rumors. Facility 47 was whispered among our circles as the place where impossible ideas were made real or buried. It was where men who asked dangerous questions were either elevated or erased. My hands trembled as I packed, but my heart beat with anticipation. I had spent my career studying the boundaries of human endurance, and now, it seemed, they wanted me to push beyond them. The drive through frozen landscapes felt endless. Grey skies blurred with snow-covered ground, and the silence inside the car was oppressive. My escort never spoke. When we finally arrived, the building loomed like a concrete tomb, its walls stained with secrets. Inside, a long corridor led me to a steel door. It opened with a hiss, revealing a room with 3 men seated at a table. None introduced themselves. They didn't need to. Their uniforms spoke louder than words. One of them slid a folder toward me. "You will oversee Project Nocturne," he said flatly. I opened it. Diagrams of containment chambers, chemical formulas, psychological profiles. "A stimulant," he continued, "one that will eliminate the need for sleep, indefinitely." I looked up, searching for hesitation in their faces. There was none, only the cold certainty of men who had decided the outcome before the test began. "The Americans are years ahead," another officer added. "They're creating soldiers who won't tire, won't question orders, won't dream." I swallowed hard. I should have asked why they chose me, but I already knew. I had spent too many nights lecturing about human limitations being illusions. They had found someone willing to peel back the curtain. That night, alone in my assigned quarters, I stared at the ceiling and felt a creeping exhilaration. If we could conquer sleep, what else could we conquer? Death? Fear? The soul itself? I closed my eyes briefly, but rest didn't come. My mind spun with possibilities and consequences. I thought of the 5 subjects they had already selected. Men stripped of names, reduced to numbers and offenses. They would not be mourned, but would they be remembered? Dawn came grey and silent. My first official briefing was set for 7 a.m. I dressed in the standard white coat they provided, its stiffness unfamiliar, almost ceremonial. As I walked to the assembly hall, I passed locked doors and heard muffled sounds, or perhaps my imagination filled in what reality mercifully withheld. Inside, a small group of researchers stood rigidly, eyes hollow from years of obedience. I realized I was the outsider, the one who still carried questions. But soon I would join their ranks, or I would vanish like those who asked too much. The project was no longer theory. It was motion. The chamber was ready. The gas compound had been synthesized. They were waiting for me, and I was ready to meet them. The chamber was a masterpiece of cold efficiency. Steel walls, polished to a sterile shine, reflected nothing but emptiness. Every seam was reinforced, every bolt checked twice. There were no doors, only a hatch operated remotely. One-way mirrors lined the far wall, allowing us to observe without being observed. Or so we thought. At the top corners, vents waited to release the gas. The formula was classified beyond clearance levels I would never reach. But I knew its purpose, a stimulant powerful enough to obliterate the body's need for sleep. It had never been tested outside of theory. There was no protocol for reversal. In the center of the chamber, 5 cots sat equidistant, each with thin blankets and chains bolted to the floor. A small table with playing cards, a single bucket in the corner. No windows, no clocks, no escape. They arrived in shackles. 5 men whose names had been stripped away, replaced with numbers, all condemned for treason, sabotage, or acts unspeakable in official reports. Disposable lives, chosen for the simple fact that no one would ask where they had gone. Subject 1. Tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes defiant even as he shuffled forward. A former officer stripped of rank and purpose. He glanced at me once and I felt him measure me, as if deciding whether I was worth hating. Subject 2, thin, wiry, with nervous hands that never stopped moving. He smiled too often, too broadly, and I sensed madness lingering just beneath the surface. Subject 3, older than the others, gaunt and silent. His gaze never lifted from the floor. When ordered to sit, he obeyed without hesitation or emotion. Subject 4, scars ran along his neck, souvenirs of failed nooses. He laughed when they locked his chains as though he'd been here before. Subject 5, small, unremarkable, but his eyes followed me with unsettling calm, as though he already knew how this would end. As the chamber sealed, the atmosphere changed. The subjects, still uncertain, tested the limits, rattling chains, muttering curses. But soon, curiosity replaced defiance. They examined the cots, the cards, the vents. The room became their world. We initiated gas flow at 2,000 hours. The hiss was faint but constant, a presence more than a sound. The subjects reacted quickly, pacing, talking faster, energy rising like a tide. Their conversations turned from mundane to manic, stories, laughter, arguments, then silence. I watched for hours, unable to tear my eyes away. Every twitch, every glance became a thread in the pattern I desperately wanted to understand. I recorded observations meticulously, but the notes became something else. Reflections of my own thoughts. They weren't just subjects anymore. They were mirrors. Each paranoia mirrored my doubts. Each outburst echoed frustrations I dared not voice. I began to wonder if the gas affected me as well, seeping through unseen cracks, altering perception. At night, I dreamed of steel walls and breathless chambers. I woke with the sound of distant whispers that vanished as soon as my eyes opened. My colleagues dismissed these symptoms as fatigue, but I knew better. I wasn't observing them. I was observing myself through them. On the 4th day, Subject 2 began speaking to the walls, whispering secrets in a language I didn't recognize. The others watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination. Subject 1 tried to assert dominance, but his authority was slipping. The group dynamic fractured, reformed, then fractured again. The chamber became a living entity, pulsing with tension. And outside, we watched. Or perhaps we participated. I no longer knew if the barrier between them and us was steel or illusion. The first day felt almost ordinary. The subjects chatted in low tones, pacing the chamber with restless energy. They played cards, exchanging glances filled with suspicion, but not yet hostility. Subject 1 attempted to maintain order, assigning tasks and routines as though still commanding troops. Subject 2 joked incessantly, his nervous laughter infecting the others. Subject 3 sat silently, observing. Subject 4 hummed songs no one recognized. Subject 5 simply watched, always watching. By the second night, the atmosphere shifted. The gas had sharpened their minds, but frayed their patience. Conversations became heated, disagreements flared over trivial matters. Who had more space, whose turn it was to use the bucket. The cot chains rattled more often, tension vibrating through every surface. I made note of their agitation, but deep down, I felt it too. 48 hours without sleep turned the chamber into a pressure cooker. Subject 2 accused Subject 3 of sabotage. Subject 4 laughed hysterically whenever confronted, feeding the growing paranoia. Subject 1's voice grew hoarse from constant commands that were increasingly ignored. Outside the chamber, I felt the same tightness coil in my chest. Sleep eluded me. I sat in the observation room, eyes fixed on the one-way glass, and time dissolved into a blur of flickering monitors and scribbled notes. The other researchers took shifts, but I couldn't leave. I was compelled to witness everything. It was on the third night that the whispers began. At first, I thought they came from the subjects, incoherent muttering captured by the microphones. But when I adjusted the volume, I heard only static. And beneath that static, faint pulses of sound, rhythmic patterns that didn't align with human speech. I checked the recordings. The playback was distorted, filled with garbled fragments and bursts of white noise. My colleagues blamed equipment failure. I wasn't convinced. Inside the chamber, the men stopped speaking to each other and began speaking to the walls. Subject 2 pressed his ear against the steel, whispering secrets. Subject 4 scratched symbols into the floor with his fingernails until they bled. Subject 5 never broke eye contact with the glass. I found myself staring back, unable to look away. The arguments grew violent. Subject 1 struck Subject 3 for refusing to answer a question. Subject 3 didn't retaliate. He merely smiled, a thin, unsettling smile that made the room feel colder. My notes became erratic. Sentences trailed off mid-thought. I found myself writing words I didn't remember choosing. My reflection in the observation window looked unfamiliar. Pale, gaunt, eyes ringed with exhaustion. I started hearing faint knocks when no one was there. The radio equipment crackled with bursts of sound I couldn't identify. Were they talking to each other? Or to something else? I asked myself that question repeatedly, scribbling it into margins until the paper tore. On the fourth night, the whispers inside the chamber stopped. The silence was heavier than noise. The men sat in their corners, eyes wide, unmoving. I leaned closer to the glass, desperate for any sign of life. Then Subject 5 smiled, slowly, deliberately. And though the speakers remained silent, I heard his voice, inside my head. The fifth night began with screaming. At first, just Subject 2, shrill, piercing cries that rattled through the speakers like knives scraping metal. He clawed at his face, at his chest, tearing at skin as if trying to rip something out from beneath. The others followed soon after, each voice overlapping in a cacophony of raw terror and madness. Hours passed. The screams never stopped. I sat frozen in the observation room, headphones clamped to my ears, the sound drilling into my skull. Blood vessels burst in their eyes, their voices cracked, strained, then finally ruptured. Silence did not come as relief. It arrived as suffocation. When the screams died, they simply sat, motionless. Their mouths opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Only silence, thick and oppressive, heavier than the walls of the chamber itself. I should have called it off. My assistants whispered warnings, casting uneasy glances at the monitors, at me. But I silenced them with a look they didn't recognize. I had crossed a line I could no longer see. I told them, data comes first, morality comes later. I began to see things behind the glass. At first, shadows shifting just out of sync with the subject's movements. A figure moving to the left when the man in that corner remained perfectly still. Blurred shapes flickering along the walls, crawling like ink in water. I rubbed my eyes until they burned, but the shadows remained. Subject 4 began pacing again, dragging his bleeding feet across the floor, leaving streaks of red that formed patterns I didn't understand. Subject 1 sat with his back against the wall, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes open but unfocused. Subject 5, always watching, still fixed his gaze on me, though the glass was supposed to be one way. I tapped the intercom button. "Identify yourselves," I whispered. No response. "State your condition." Nothing. I increased the volume. Static roared in my ears, followed by faint clicking sounds, rhythmic, deliberate, like an insect tapping on glass. I turned to my colleagues, but they refused to meet my eyes. One technician muttered that we should stop the gas, open the chamber. I shook my head. "We're close," I said. My voice cracked with exhaustion. Close to what, I didn't know. The staff grew restless. A nurse reported hearing scratching sounds from within the walls. Another claimed to have seen movement in the surveillance corridor when it should have been empty. I dismissed them all. Weakness disguised as caution, but I could feel it too. The weight pressing on the room, suffocating logic, drowning reason. The recordings degraded further. Every attempt to play back the audio resulted in garbled distortions, voices layered over voices, whispers in languages I didn't know. The static hissed like breath against my ear. I stared into the chamber. Subject 3 sat cross-legged, rocking gently, his eyes rolled back. Subject 2 traced bloody lines along the walls, each stroke trembling with purpose. Subject 1, gone. His cot empty, chains loose on the floor. I blinked, rubbed my temples, looked again. He was back, seated exactly where he'd been, unmoving. Had he ever left? The lights flickered. My reflection in the glass smiled at me when I wasn't smiling. I told myself it was fatigue, lack of sleep. But when I blinked, the figure on the other side of the glass didn't vanish. It waved. Panic spread through the staff. They begged me to terminate the experiment. I refused. My superiors demanded results. I had promised them breakthroughs, not excuses. I stared at Subject 5. His mouth moved silently. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt them, like cold fingers wrapping around my thoughts. "We can show you," they seemed to say. I reached for the intercom button once more, my hand trembling. "Continue," I whispered. And in that silence, something on the other side smiled back. On the 15th day, the order came. The generals wanted answers, the technicians wanted it to end. But I wanted to see. The chamber lights had dimmed to a dull, flickering glow. The speakers offered nothing but silence, broken only by bursts of static and soft, wet sounds I couldn't identify. I stared through the glass and felt an emptiness inside me that no data could fill. We prepared to breach. The chamber's outer locks hissed open with reluctant groans. The inner hatch remained sealed, the only thing separating us from whatever we had created. My hands shook as I input the code. For a moment I hesitated. Then the hatch groaned open. The stench hit first, a suffocating wave of rot, blood, and something else. Something metallic and sour, like fear distilled into liquid. They were unrecognizable. Subject 1 sat in the corner, strips of flesh peeled from his forearms, muscle exposed and twitching. He gnawed methodically on his own tissue, eyes glazed and distant, as though performing a sacred ritual. Subject 2 lay on the floor, his abdomen torn open. He used his fingernails, or what remained of them, to drag entrails from his body, arranging them into patterns I could not decipher. Subject 3's face was gone, a bloody mask of torn skin and exposed bone. His chest rose and fell, slow and steady, as though pain was a distant memory. Subject 4 rocked back and forth, arms wrapped tightly around himself. His lips moved rapidly in silence, reciting some private prayer to something neither holy nor human. And Subject 5. He stood. He stood in the center of the room, arms outstretched, eyes locked on mine. His skin was carved with words, letters etched in blood and tissue. His lips curled into a smile so calm, so knowing, that I nearly wept. The walls were covered in smears of crimson. Symbols, phrases, "We are awake," scrawled repeatedly in jagged strokes. Another message, larger than the rest, read, "Keep the gas on." One of the soldiers behind me gagged. Another whispered a prayer. I stepped forward. "Subjects," I said, my voice trembling, "we are here to help you. Step out of the chamber." They didn't move. "Step out," I repeated. Subject 5's smile widened, his voice hoarse but steady. "We do not want to leave." "Step out," I insisted. He shook his head slowly. "We must stay awake. Keep the gas on." I felt a cold shiver trace my spine. The soldiers raised their rifles instinctively. "No," I said softly. "Lower your weapons." They hesitated. "I said lower them." Reluctantly, the rifles dipped. I took another step forward. "Why?" I asked. My voice was a whisper lost in the oppressive silence. Subject 5's eyes gleamed with something ancient, something beyond comprehension. "Because without sleep," he rasped, "we are closer to truth, closer to them." I felt my breath catch. "To who?" He only smiled. The soldiers broke. One of them vomited in the corner. Another turned and ran down the corridor, boots echoing like thunder. But I stood there, frozen. I had pushed humanity to its edge, and it smiled back at me. I wanted to recoil. I wanted to run. But some part of me, the part that had accepted the project, that had sat through the screams and the silence, felt pride. This was beyond science, beyond war. This was revelation. One of the subjects, I couldn't tell which one anymore, began to hum, a low, vibrating tone that made the walls seem to pulse. "We are not meant to sleep," Subject 5 whispered. "Sleep blinds us. Sleep hides them." I felt my knees weaken. The soldiers shouted again, demanding they leave the chamber. But the subjects only laughed. "Keep the gas on," they repeated in unison. I took one last step toward the hatch. The weight of my choices pressed heavier than the steel walls, and I realized I didn't want them to leave either. We tried to save them. Medical teams rushed in with gurneys, syringes, and instruments that suddenly felt laughably inadequate. The soldiers held their positions, rifles trembling, eyes wide with terror, thinly masked as duty. The subjects resisted, not with violence, but with silence, an immovable refusal to cooperate. Their bodies convulsed when separated from the gas lines. Subject 3's heart stopped within minutes of exposure to fresh air. His body spasmed once, and then lay still, a smile frozen on what remained of his face. Subject 2 bit through his own tongue as medics tried to restrain him. Blood filled his throat, but he continued to hum until his lungs gave out. Only Subject 5 remained conscious, strapped to the gurney with reinforced restraints. His chest heaved with effort, veins bulging, eyes locked on mine. The room was chaos, monitors beeping wildly, doctors shouting numbers I could no longer process. But all I could hear was his breath, slow, controlled. Then he spoke. "We are what you locked out of your mind." The words weren't spoken in the usual sense. His mouth moved, but the sound didn't come from his throat. It came from everywhere. It vibrated in the walls, in the floor, and most of all, inside my head. I staggered back, clutching at my temples. The voices echoed, layered over each other in languages both ancient and unknown. I heard my name spoken in tones that made my blood run cold. The doctors froze, the nurses paled, the soldiers raised their weapons again, unsure whether to fire or pray. I leaned closer to the restrained subject, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. "What are you?" I whispered. He smiled, not with his mouth but with his eyes, wide and unblinking. "We are what waits between waking and sleep," he said. His voice, not his voice, filled the room. "We are the dark you silence with dreams, the shadows you deny. You fed us. You freed us." The monitors around him surged, screens flickering with static before going black. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. A final recording was made, though I don't remember ordering it. I've listened to it since, though every time I do, I regret it more. A single phrase repeated over and over, spoken in voices both human and inhuman. "We are awake, and so are you." I don't know when I lost control of my body. My legs gave out, and I found myself on the floor, staring up at sterile ceiling tiles that seemed to pulse with unseen life. My colleagues called out to me, but their voices were distant, muted by the ringing in my ears. The room darkened around the edges of my vision. My breathing grew shallow, chest tight with panic. I had opened a door, and I could no longer close it. I write this from a place I cannot name. The walls are thin, the air stale, and the light flickers as though it, too, is afraid to remain. I have sealed the door, but it makes no difference. The scratching started hours ago, soft at first, like fingernails tracing patterns only they can understand. Now, the sounds come from every corner, from beneath the floorboards, from inside the vents. I haven't slept, I don't dare. They told me the experiment was over, that the chamber was destroyed, the subjects cremated, the records sealed away in vaults beneath layers of red tape and denial. But paper burns, steel corrodes, and silence. Silence never lasts. The whispers started small, fragments of thought I mistook for memory. But they grew louder, more insistent. They know my name. They speak in voices I recognize, yet twisted, distorted, echoes of men I left behind steel walls, now speaking through shadows I cannot escape. I've torn apart the radio, but the static persists. The patterns in the interference speak sentences I cannot comprehend, and when I close my eyes, I see them, pale figures with hollow eyes, smiling through cracked lips, reaching out. I thought they were locked inside that chamber, but they are not. I hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, impossibly close, a breath against my ear when no one stands behind me. I hear them now, not outside the door, but inside my head. They never left, and if you're reading this, perhaps they found you too.